Well, this Sunday we're starting a new series. And what's the name of the series? I forgot. Okay. Not everybody at the same time, right? Effervescence. Effervescence. And so we're going to talk today about being the church. About being the church in a time of crisis. I don't know if you've noticed, but we have been submerged since last year. Do you know why they call it COVID-19? Because of the year 19. They first found out in late 2019. And so now it's COVID-20, and it looks like it's going to be COVID-21 if it keeps up. And so we have been submerged in a crisis of pandemic proportions. I mean, it's worldwide. This thing is everywhere. And the church is submerged in the crisis as well. In other words, we're part of the world. We're in the world. And so we're part of the crisis as well. And as a local church, we have been dealing with all the challenges that the pandemic has posed for all of us. The changes in formatting. We went from a church that ministered only through the platform in fellowship, and all of a sudden we're in different platforms on the internet. And the isolation, what I was just praying about, I mean, the fact that we are away from each other, we can't see each other, we can't communicate the way that we like, we can't hug, we can't do anything. And the social distancing, which is not 6 feet, by the way. The 6 feet is just a number. The social distancing is more than that. In other words, now I don't even have to talk to you. Now I don't even have to look at you. Now I don't even have to acknowledge that you're there. Just keep your distance. And that's created issues for a lot of people. The face mask, okay? Yes, we're protecting each other from the virus, but we're also changing our identity. We look different, and we behave different. And so the limitations of public events. I mean, look at all the holes. Those holes were filled with people. Look how the benches are squished up. Those benches were filled with people. The limitations of our gatherings, of our public events. The testing and the uncertainty of testing. You get tested and you don't know if you're positive or negative, and 3 weeks later the test comes in and you don't know what it is. And so there's a lot of uncertainty that goes with that. And then the consequences of all of this, because everything that we're doing is having consequences. How many of you have children in your home that are spending their school year with you? Huh? Raise your hand. Okay, there's several of you. I praise God I'm out that stage. I can't imagine living in a zoo like that. I mean, you want the children to leave and you get a vacation for them for 8 hours and then they come back. But if not, then they're there the whole time. And so there's consequences. And these consequences are too many to list, and many are tragic, because when you have to deal with a death in your family, like one of the families in our church 2 days ago found out that their mother in Colombia died and because of COVID. And so we have to deal with issues like this. And there's some of it is very tragic, but the church in its local setting, that's us, Peters Road Baptist Church, and in its global settings, that's the church everywhere, must face the challenges of this COVID-19 head on. We have to face the pandemic and show that we are alive. How many of you are alive? Okay, let's all say it. We are alive. Okay, you don't sound very alive. Let's all say it. We are alive. And historically, in the face of adversity and in crisis, the church has demonstrated effervescence. Effervescence. Huh? Can you say effervescence? That's one of my favorite words, effervescence, huh? Effervescence. And effervescence, by definition, is the bubbling of a solution due to the escape of gas. And the gas may form by a chemical reaction, as in fermenting of a liquid, or by coming out of a solution after being under pressure as a carbonated drink. I want you to get the idea of effervescence, because this is a great way of illustrating how the church functions in society. Now, each one of you had a gift. How many of you got this little deal? Huh? Okay, now, whatever you do, this is not a candy. Okay? I know of people that have died because they swallowed one of these without any water. You don't want to do that, okay? This is not a candy. This is for you to use at home whenever you overeat. You know, those tacos can get to you. This is what that's for. But ever since I was a child, I've been fascinated by this little tablet of medicine, because it's effervescent. And so I want to show you how this works. Now, let me see. I'm going to have to put my mic down. Love the magic. I think I'm going to keep the mic there. Now you're supposed to go, ooh, huh? You ready? Now look at that. Yeah, I'm getting a kick out of this. Look at that. You can't imagine how many times. I mean, I love watching it, you know. It's effervescent. It's effervescent. You see the bubbles of the gas escaping, and you see how it changes everything. And so the church, when in crisis, experiences a reaction with reality, whereas the Spirit of God is unleashed in a manner that is unique, and the church comes alive in a supernatural way. Now, does that describe our church right now? Well, we're going to talk about that, huh? We want to be effervescent. History and the Bible both show us that this is a pattern of how God works with His church in a crisis. Every time you read about a crisis in history, or when you look at a crisis in the Bible, the Spirit of God brings effervescence to His people. And so this month we will be learning from the book of, guess, Acts. The book of Acts. We're going to be looking at the book of Acts, how the church experienced effervescence in the midst of crisis. And I invite you to look with me, keep your Bibles open to chapter 9 of the book of Acts for a clear example of the effervescence of the Spirit and how the church came alive. And so the first thing that I want to share with you is, number one, the reality of crisis for everyone. Now, this sounds like stating the obvious, but sometimes we have to state the obvious to understand where we are. To get to point B from point A on a map, you always have to know where point A is. And so the reference point for us is our reality of crisis. And we have to understand this, because if we don't understand it, then we don't know how to respond. And so the first thing I want to share with you is that the world is in crisis. The world is in crisis. Now, one of the things about a pandemic is that it doesn't just affect China. Remember when it started with China? Oh, those poor Chinese people. God help them. We're going to pray for them. Pray for China. They got some weird virus running around. Look at them. They're all wearing masks. They look so funny. And then it went to Spain. Ooh, so much for my vacation in Spain. And then it came home here. And it started out with a few cases up in Oregon and Washington. And you said, yeah, keep it out there. Keep it out there. Keep it far away from here. And then all of a sudden, here we are today. Hundreds of thousands of cases later, and thousands of deaths later because of this virus. And so the world is in crisis. But I want you to understand that this is nothing new. In the first century, when the passage that we read today is actually happening, the world was in deep crisis. Now, in Judea, in Palestine, in the area where the scene is taking place, the Romans were the overlords of the whole province. Now, you have to understand, the Romans, they didn't live there. They lived in Italy. They were from Rome, far away. But the Romans wanted the world. They weren't just happy with having Rome. They weren't just happy with having Italy. They wanted to rule the world. And they pretty much did. And they ruled through violence. They ruled through harshness. They demanded that everyone adapt to them. They came to a place and they said, now we own you. And so they demanded complete loyalty and even worship of the emperor as God. They said, this is our emperor. He is divine. Divine, okay? And one of them was called Augustus. And he was called Augustus because that's a word that describes a godly person, someone who has divine qualities. And so the Romans said, we want you to worship us, literally. And the Jews had a problem because they had this thing that they believed that there was only one God. And that was it. And so they came in direct clash with the Roman view of the world. And so they lived in a very harsh political environment. And to top it off, they were taxed. But they were taxed in a way that today we would cringe. I mean, how many of you complain about taxes? What? Huh? But these guys got taxed for everything. But we get taxed, but we see the results. Okay, we pay tax for the schools, we pay tax for the roads. They paid taxes so that the Romans could be richer. And so this was something that violated people. The Romans governed with violence. And they like to use crucifixions. We already know about Jesus. What happened to him? He was crucified. But Jesus wasn't the only one. He was one of thousands, okay? And so the Jews were reacting to the Romans and trying to establish their survival, but not just their survival, their dignity. And the church was right in there too. The church was part of the crisis. When we read Acts 9, verses 1 and 2, listen what it says. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He went to the high priest and requested letters from him to the synagogues in Damascus so that if he found any men or women who belonged to the way. And it's interesting because at least in my Bible, it's capitalized, okay? In Greek, the word is hodos. That was the term that was used for the believers in Jesus in the beginning of the church period. They were called the way. And so Paul is on a mission to eliminate the way so that he might bring them as prisoners to Jerusalem. Okay? This is what Paul is doing to the church. And how do you think the church reacted? The church has always been in the world, okay? The events in this passage probably happened around the year 34 of the time of, in other words, the time of Christ, after Jesus. Jesus had been crucified a few years earlier, probably in 30 of the Christian era. So 34, 30, there's only 4-year difference. And the church is becoming a threat to the Jewish establishment. The church is alive. In the middle of that crisis, the church is effervescent. The church is alive and growing. And of course, this must be stopped. Stephen, one of the church leaders, was stoned outside the gates of Jerusalem. And one of the witnesses who was there was this young man called what? Saul. And so Saul, the young and upcoming Pharisee, is bent on stopping the advance of the church. He wants to stamp out the followers of Christ. He saw a threat extending to Damascus, so he got orders to go out there to exterminate the Christ followers. He wanted to get them and bring them to Jerusalem for trial. He was a jihadist. He was a man on a holy mission of destruction. He was a terrorist to the newly emerging church. And so you have the world in crisis, you have the church in crisis, and today nothing has changed. Both the world and the church are in crisis. The only thing that has changed is the crisis. And so today the world's being ravaged by this pandemic of a deadly virus that we call COVID-19 that nobody knows except that it looks like a little crown, okay? The coronavirus. It's pretty cool, huh? And so people are afraid and unsure as the numbers of affected people continues to rise and the number of fatalities increase. The world's in a major crisis. The church is in the same crisis. The world is now pushing the church out of the public square. There are many Sauls today that are devoting their lives to destroying the church. But the sad part is that even the church itself is hiding and diluting itself in the background of this crisis. No, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that we have to go out there and become targets for the COVID-19 virus. What I'm saying is that we cannot stop being the church. We have to do something. Our church is no exception. We cannot sit still and do nothing while the church and the world are in crisis. We must experience effervescence, or we will cease to exist, or worse, we're not going to have any impact, and then nobody cares. Nobody in the world or anywhere else will care if we just play church. And so, in this grim reality of crisis, the good news is that God is God's not just alive. I mean, that's great. But God is with us. And God is for us. And God is always in action on behalf of his church and of his children. As a result, we go to number 2. The reality of a threat turned into a blessing. How many of you believe that this COVID-19 thing can be a blessing to you? Huh? Everybody's going, that's not a blessing. Huh? But let me share something with you. Saul was a man on a mission for evil. He wanted to destroy the church, but he got turned around. And so look at the verses here from 3 to 6. As he traveled and he was nearing Damascus, a light from heaven suddenly flashed around him. Now, in the book of Acts, 3 times the testimony of Saul is given. This one is the narration from Luke. But 2 other times, Paul tells his own testimony. And one of the times, he says that it was at noon. So at noon, I don't know if you've ever been to the Middle East, but all of that area is pretty much desert. I mean, there's rocks everywhere, and it's pretty deserted. And so at noon and with desert, I mean, how much light is there? I mean, there's a flood of light. So can you imagine that in the middle of noon, all this light, and he sees a bigger light? Now that will catch your attention. And so Saul sees a light from heaven, and he falls to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, here's something interesting. Saul wasn't persecuting Jesus. Jesus was already crucified according to Saul, and Jesus was somewheres. We know that Jesus was resurrected. But Jesus said that they were persecuting him. And so it's interesting that whenever we experience crisis, one of the realities is that the Lord Jesus is in the crisis with us. We don't have a God that just says, hey, you're in a crisis. See, you call me when you need me. He joins us, and he is with us. I don't know about you, but I felt the presence of God many times during this crisis. And so God is with his church. And so Saul replies, who are you, Lord? And he said, I'm Jesus, the one you are persecuting. And he replied, but get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. Now, I want you to understand, in the middle of a crisis, we experience change. And God tells us what to do. In other words, we're not trying to figure out how. God leads his church. God leads each one of you to deal with whatever the crisis is throwing at you. And so what we see is that Saul had a personal encounter with Jesus. To say that the resurrected Jesus, the Messiah, turned his life upside down is an understatement. Any encounter with God has a dramatic effect on your life. And so the result was spiritual effervescence. Spiritual effervescence. This same Paul is the one that goes on and says in Galatians 2:20, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. What a turnaround. Saul would never be the same again. Saul was changed and now had a mission for good, but none of the circumstances changed. The Romans were still there governing Palestine. The Jews were still trying to keep control of the religious situation. The church was still being persecuted. However, the threat of Saul the persecutor was turned miraculously into a huge blessing for the church. Saul the persecutor became Paul the missionary. And all of a sudden, the missionary Paul would go on to start churches and ultimately die as a martyr for Jesus and his church. And today things are no different. The reality is that threats can be turned into blessings. The circumstances have not changed, but people can change. The virus can become the agent of effervescence for the people of this church and for Christians anywhere. For example, before we barely had an online presence, okay? We barely had a rinky-dinky website, and we barely had something that you could watch. And now, our church is reaching into the world, literally, because of this. And many churches have expanded their ministries from a local perspective to a global perspective. Now think about this. This is pretty big. We went from being local to being global. Okay? There are people that are watching our services and our Bible studies from all over the world, literally. And so this is something new. So how can this occur? Okay? How can this occur in a way that we can see it? How can the curse of this crisis become a blessing for us? And it because of the reality of change in the crisis. Now, we are all allergic to change. We want everything to stay how? The same, huh? We want everything to stay the same. How many of you have been taking a shower and you're nice and hot, you know, the little water, and then somebody flushes the toilet, or somebody turns on the washing machine, or somebody turns on the dishwasher, and then what happens to your hot water? Woo! And you're, ah! We don't like change. This is how we react to any change, big or little. And so, in order to survive the crisis, in order to see the blessing of the crisis, we have to experience the reality of change in the crisis. Saul was changed, okay? I don't have time to read to you verses 21 through 25, but you can see that this is a different Saul, okay? People would say, isn't this the man who in Jerusalem was destroying those who called on this name and then came here for the purpose of taking them as prisoners to the chief priest? And so Saul was changed. He was preaching Jesus. And now the persecutor was being persecuted. They had to lower him on a basket because they were looking out for him. They wanted to kill him. The one who wanted to kill all of a sudden is the one that's being chased out because they want to kill him. Talk about a change, okay? And then the church was changed, okay? The church had to deal with the reality that this Paul was now one of us. The Saul that we hated is now the Paul that we love. And so when he arrived in Jerusalem, he tried to associate with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, since they did not believe that he was a disciple. And so the church had to deal with the incredible change of Paul's conversion, Saul's conversion. And as a result, the church was encouraged, had peace, was made stronger, and increased in numbers. Now listen to the last verse one of the last verses in Acts 9, verse 31. It says, so the church throughout all Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, in 4 years since Jesus had left, the church had spread out to Judea, Galilee, Samaria. They had peace, being built up and walking in the fear of the Lord and in the encouragement of the Holy Spirit. And it increased in numbers. So in the middle of the crisis, in the middle of this crisis, the church, because of the work of the Spirit, was experiencing what? Effervescence. The church was experiencing effervescence. The world was changed. People who were pagans or Jews all of a sudden became followers of Jesus and part of the church. The light increased even though the darkness still prevailed. So, we're all in the same crisis. The crisis has had many negative consequences for people and for the church. And so when you go to the first century, you see a list of negative consequences. When you go to today in the 21st century, you see a list of negative consequences. But in the middle of all of this, the Spirit of Jesus is at work. And when the Spirit shows up in your life, in your church, in your world, there's always effervescence. And so, like Paul, you can experience an encounter with the Spirit of Jesus and experience the effervescence, the transformation of such an encounter. Now, Paul's life was radically changed in one moment in time. And today could be that one moment in time for you. And so the gospel is very simple. The Creator God, the God who made heaven and earth, came down to this earth and was born of a virgin 2,000 years ago in a little town called Bethlehem. And they called his name Jesus. Jesus lived and taught who the Father was. And he was killed on a cross. He was murdered innocently, because there was nothing that they could prove that made him a criminal or a blasphemer. And Jesus spent 3 days in the grave and then was resurrected. He showed himself to many people. And then Paul says, lastly, almost like an abortion to me, but Jesus today is the same Jesus that Paul met on the road to Damascus. And he can change your life today. In the midst of this crisis of COVID-19, many years ago, my life was changed. Today, you could experience the fullness of all the promises of God in your life. If you do not have a personal relationship with Jesus, this is your chance. And so you pray and you say, Lord Jesus, I recognize that you are real. I recognize that you are in control of this crisis. And I confess you as my Savior and my Lord. I repent of my sins. Come into my life and bring the effervescence that only you can bring. Change me. If you made that prayer, would you let it be known? Just raise your hand. If you prayed, you can pray anytime, anywhere. And if you prayed that prayer and you have not been baptized, then please send me a note, send me an email, talk to me, say, I want to be baptized. Because this is the first act of obedience of a believer. But then it doesn't stop there, okay? Like the early church, this church, Peter's Road Baptist Church, can also experience peace Can you imagine peace and growth in this crisis? The church can experience the effervescence of the Spirit as it allows the Spirit of Jesus to transform, to change the church in whatever ways the Spirit chooses to transform. Now, let me share with you the way that the early church experienced many transformations in its time. It went from being in the temple where it met, and then it went into the homes. It went from being hidden to being public. It went from being afraid to being bold. It went from being tolerated to being persecuted. It went from being silent to being outspoken. It went from being unknown to being known. It went from being local to becoming global. And so what changes will the effervescence of the Spirit of Jesus bring to Peter's Road Baptist Church through this crisis? Are we ready to make the changes? Are we ready to pay the price the changes require? I love doing this. I really do. But I could do this all day. Huh? This is who we are when the Spirit of God comes to His church. This is who He wants us to be. This is who we can be. But this is something that we must decide. And so we can be effervescent or we can be flat. It's up to you. And so if there are any of you who want to be a part of an effervescent movement of the Spirit in this local church, then I invite you to become a member of the church. Talk to me. Send us an email. I want to be a member of this church. But it's not just the little card that says you're a member. It's the fact that you are part of an effervescent movement of the Spirit of God. So if this is what you want to see in your church and you're willing to accept the reality of change, then where you are, stand before God and before your brothers and sisters in the church and say, I want an effervescent church. In this crisis, I want to be a part of an effervescent church. If this is who you are, then stand where you are. Stand where you are if you want to be a part of a church that is effervescent in the world, that is effervescent in this crisis. Amen. Amen. Just to see you, you cannot imagine the encouragement that you bring. Because what we're telling God is, Lord, we're ready to be effervescent. We're ready to be the people of God. And so we're going to pray, and then we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper for the first time in months. Father God, thank you because you are the Spirit that makes the church effervescent. Lord, it's not the giftedness of any pastor. It's not the loyalty of any members. It's not the resources that the church has. It's just the Spirit of God taking whatever we have and making it effervescent. And so, Lord, I thank you because my brothers and sisters want to be the people of God in the crisis that are effervescent. And I don't know what that means. I don't know where we're going to go. I don't know what we're going to do. I know we have to make changes. But we want to make those changes that you bring to us. We want to make a difference in your name for your glory in this crisis. Lord, make us effervescent. And the church said, amen. Amen. You may be seated, and I'm going to ask you to take